My name is Cora Brooks. For 20 years, I practiced medicine not in sterile, well-lit hospitals, but in the heart of the world's forgotten corners. I've set broken bones by the light of a kerosene lamp in the Andes, delivered babies in makeshift clinics during monsoon season in Southeast Asia, and held the hands of the dying in dusty, sun-scorched refugee camps. My work with the Global Health Corps was a calling, a way to stitch together the torn fabric of humanity, one person at a time. It taught me that healing is a quiet act, often invisible, and that the deepest wounds are not always the ones that bleed. But all that training, all that experience in navigating the fragile landscapes of human suffering, did little to prepare me for the feeling of standing on the familiar flagstone path leading to my grandmother's cottage, a stranger at my own front door. It was early October, and the air in Havenwood, Oregon, was crisp with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. The maple trees that lined Willow Creek Lane were a riot of gold and crimson, their leaves skittering across the pavement like scattered jewels. I had just paid the taxi driver, my duffel bag, containing little more than a few changes of clothes and 2 decades of memories, feeling impossibly heavy on my shoulder. The cottage, nestled behind a low stone wall overgrown with ivy, looked just as I remembered it. Its cedar shingles were weathered to a soft silver, and the porch swing my grandfather had hung was still there, swaying gently in the breeze. For a moment, a wave of profound peace washed over me. I was home, but the peace was fleeting. The rose bushes my grandmother, Annalise, had so lovingly tended were gone, replaced by manicured, soulless boxwoods. The warm, buttery light that used to spill from the windows, promising comfort and cocoa, was dark. A chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air settled deep in my bones. I pressed the small brass bell, its familiar chime echoing in the sudden silence. After a long moment, the door opened a crack. It was my sister, Claire. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup immaculate. She looked at me not with the warmth of reunion, but with the cool appraisal of a stranger. There was no recognition in her eyes, only a flicker of annoyance. "Cora," she said, her voice flat. "What are you doing here?" It wasn't a question of welcome, but of trespass. The words caught in my throat. "Claire? I'm back. My contract ended. I came home." She didn't open the door any wider. Her hand remained firmly on the knob. "This isn't your home anymore. You haven't lived here in 20 years. The casual cruelty of her words was like a physical blow. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. "What are you talking about? This is Grandma Annalise's cottage. She left it to me." A small, mirthless smile touched Claire's lips. It was an expression I knew well, one that always preceded a dismissal. Grandma's wishes were a long time ago. Things change. Dad and I have been handling the estate. We decided it was best to sell. "Sell?" I whispered, the word tasting like ash. "You can't. This place." My gaze drifted past her, trying to catch a glimpse of the familiar living room, the stone fireplace, the bookshelf filled with my grandmother's worn poetry books. "Where are Mom and Dad?" "They're not here," she said, her tone clipped and final. "And they don't want to see you. You made your choice when you left, Cora. You chose strangers over your own family. You can't just show up and expect us to welcome you with open arms." The door began to close. Desperation clawed at me. "Claire, please. Let's just talk." "There's nothing to talk about," she said, her voice hardening. "If you don't leave the property, I'll have to call the sheriff." The door clicked shut, the sound echoing the closing of a door in my heart. I stood there, frozen on the flagstone path, the cool Oregon air feeling thin and unbreathable. I looked at the cottage, this sanctuary of my childhood, this place built not just with wood and stone, but with love and memory, and I saw it for what it had become, a fortress, and I was on the outside. The battle wasn't against a disease or a disaster, it was against the quiet, unyielding wall of my own family. And for the first time in my life, I felt utterly, completely lost. I didn't leave Havenwood that night. The thought of getting back in a cab and disappearing again felt like a surrender I wasn't ready to make. Instead, I found a small, clean room at the old Millstream Motel on the edge of town, the kind of place with a humming ice machine and faded floral bedspreads. I sat on the edge of the stiff mattress and stared out the window at the flashing neon sign, its pink and green glow painting a lonely scene. The cottage on Willow Creek Lane wasn't just a building, it was the repository of my soul. It was where Grandma Annalise taught me to identify birds by their song and to find constellations in the vast, ink-black sky. It was where she'd read me stories of brave women and faraway lands, planting the seeds of wanderlust that would eventually lead me away. In her last letter to me, written in a shaky but determined hand just before she passed, she had been so clear. "The cottage is your anchor, my little sparrow," she wrote. "No matter how far you fly, you will always have a place to land." How had her anchor become a weapon used against me? The next morning, I did the only thing I could think of. I walked to the Daily Grind, the coffee shop on Main Street that had been the heart of Havenwood's social life for as long as I could remember. The smell of roasted coffee beans and cinnamon was a comforting balm. I was looking for a ghost from my past, a lifeline. And I found him. Ben Carter was sitting at a corner table, a laptop open in front of him, a furrow of concentration on his brow. He looked older, of course. His dark hair was shorter, with distinguished threads of silver at the temples, but his eyes were the same, kind and intelligent, the same eyes that had looked out for me when we were kids building forts in the woods behind my grandmother's house. He had become a lawyer, a small-town attorney who, unlike me, had chosen to put down roots right where he started. He looked up as I approached, and a slow smile of disbelief spread across his face. "Cora Brooks," he said, his voice warm with genuine surprise. "I'll be damned. I thought you were off saving the world somewhere in the tropics." Tears pricked my eyes, a surprising and unwelcome response. I hadn't cried in front of my sister, but the simple kindness in Ben's voice undid me. "The world will have to save itself for a little while," I said, my voice thick with emotion. I think I'm the one who needs saving now." I told him everything. The words tumbled out in a rush, the homecoming, Claire's coldness, the threat of selling the cottage. I told him about Grandma Annalise's letter, the promise she had made. He listened patiently, his expression shifting from warmth to concern, and then to a quiet, focused anger. When I finished, he closed his laptop. "Okay," he said, his voice calm and steady. "First, you're not lost. You're just temporarily misplaced. Second, you did the right thing by coming to me. Let's see what they've actually done." We spent the next hour in his modest office above the hardware store. The space smelled of old books and lemon polish. With a few clicks on his computer, Ben pulled up the county property records. My breath caught in my chest when I saw it. The cottage at 214 Willow Creek Lane was no longer listed under my grandmother's estate. It had been transferred, 6 months prior, to a company called Aspen Grove Properties, LLC. "I've never heard of them," I said, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. Ben's fingers flew across the keyboard. "They were incorporated a year ago. The registered agent is Marcus Thorne, Claire's husband." I breathed. The pieces were starting to fall into place, forming a picture I didn't want to see. "It gets worse," Ben said, his voice grim. He turned the monitor toward me. On the screen was a scanned copy of a quitclaim deed. It was the document that had transferred the property. And there, at the bottom, on the line marked Grantor, was a signature. A messy, unfamiliar scrawl that was supposed to be mine. Cora Brooks. I stared at the name, my name, forged in ink. It was a violation so profound it stole the air from my lungs. They hadn't just taken a house, they had stolen my identity, my connection to my past, my grandmother's last gift. They had erased me. "That's not my signature," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Ben looked at me, his gaze steady and reassuring. "I know," he said softly. "And we're going to prove it. This isn't a battle, Cora. This is a restoration. We're just going to put things back the way they were meant to be." In the days that followed, Havenwood became a landscape of discovery, both legal and personal. Ben worked with a quiet, methodical diligence, filing paperwork, making calls, and tracing the faint, tangled threads of the deceit. He was my anchor now, a calm presence in the storm of my confusion and hurt. While he navigated the legal labyrinth, I began to navigate the labyrinth of my own past. I took long walks along the familiar trails of Havenwood Park, the scent of pine and damp moss filling the air. I sat by the creek that gave my childhood street its name, watching the water flow over smooth, gray stones. With every step, with every quiet moment of reflection, I began to understand something crucial. My family's betrayal wasn't a sudden event. It was the culmination of years of quiet erosion. I had left Havenwood at 19, full of youthful idealism and a burning desire to make a difference in a world that felt so much bigger and more important than my small hometown. My letters home were filled with stories of my work, of the people I was helping. I rarely asked about their lives, about my father's struggling hardware business, or Claire's quiet ambitions to be a painter, ambitions that had slowly faded into the responsibilities of being a wife and mother in a small town. I had seen their lives as small, and in my well-intentioned but arrogant youth, I had made them feel that way. I hadn't seen their resentment growing in the shadows of my absence. I hadn't understood that to them, my letters weren't missives from a hero. They were reminders of the daughter and sister who had chosen a world that didn't include them. My father, Arthur, was a man who measured worth in presence and practicality. My long absences, my work that brought in no fortune, must have looked like a personal rejection of everything he valued. And Claire, my talented, sensitive sister, had stayed, had cared for our aging parents, had shouldered the burdens I had so easily shrugged off. In her eyes, I had taken the freedom while she was left with the duty. The cottage, my grandmother's legacy, must have felt like the final, unbearable injustice, a reward for the one who had left. This realization didn't excuse their actions. The forgery, the lies, they were a profound betrayal. But understanding the source of their pain began to shift something inside me. My raw anger started to soften, replaced by a deep, aching sorrow. It wasn't a war I needed to win, but a wound I needed to understand. The fight was no longer just about a house. It was about reclaiming my own story, about finding my place not just on a property deed, but within the fractured narrative of my own family. One afternoon, I gathered my courage and drove to my parents' house, a tidy ranch-style home on the other side of town. My father was in the front yard, raking leaves into a neat pile. He moved with a stiff, deliberate slowness that spoke of age and weariness. He looked up as I got out of the car, his face an impassive mask. "Cora," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. It was a statement, not a greeting. "Dad," I said, my hands trembling slightly. "I needed to talk to you. About the cottage." He leaned the rake against the oak tree and crossed his arms over his chest. It was a defensive posture I knew well. "Claire told me you were in town. Stirring up trouble." "I'm not trying to stir up trouble," I said, struggling to keep my voice even. "I'm trying to understand. Grandma Annalise left the cottage to me." "You know she did." His jaw tightened. "Your grandmother was a romantic. She didn't understand the real world. A house needs to be cared for. It has taxes, a mortgage, a leaking roof. It needs someone to be there. You were never there, Cora. You were off chasing causes on the other side of the world. That was my work, Dad. My life. And this is ours," he shot back, his voice rising with a long-suppressed bitterness. "Claire has been here. She and Marcus, they've been the ones checking on us, fixing things, being a family. They earned the right to make decisions about the property. You forfeited that right when you walked away." The word forfeited hung in the air between us, cold and sharp. In his mind, my life of service was an abandonment. My grandmother's gift wasn't a legacy of love, but a piece of real estate I hadn't earned through proximity. "Signing my name on a legal document is not making a decision," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "It's a crime." For the first time, a flicker of something, shame, perhaps, or fear, crossed his face. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that familiar, stubborn pride. "We did what we had to do to protect our family's assets," he said stiffly. "You wouldn't understand." He turned his back on me and picked up the rake, a clear dismissal. I stood there for a long moment, the scent of burning leaves filling the air. I had come seeking an explanation, perhaps even an apology. I left with a painful clarity. They had built a story in which they were the victims, and I was the villain, a story that justified their actions. And no matter what I said, I couldn't change the narrative they had chosen to believe. I walked away not with anger, but with a quiet resolve. I couldn't make them see the truth, but I could stand in my own. I didn't need their permission or their approval to be who I was. The battle wasn't to win them over, it was to honor myself and the legacy of love my grandmother had entrusted to me. I was drawing a boundary, not with bricks and mortar, but with self-respect. It was the healthiest, most painful thing I had ever done. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was in Ben's office, watching the droplets trace paths down the window pane, when he let out a low whistle. "I think I found our leverage," he said, a note of excitement in his voice. He had been digging into the financials of Aspen Grove Properties. It turned out my brother-in-law, Marcus, had been using the cottage as collateral for a series of high-risk business loans. He was in over his head, and the sale of the cottage wasn't just about cutting me out, it was about bailing him out of a significant financial hole. He was planning to use the proceeds from the sale to cover his debts, Ben explained. And he needed to do it fast, before his creditors came calling. That's why they rushed the transfer. That's why they forged your name. But there was more. Ben had found the notary who had stamped the forged deed. Her name was Linda Gable. I recognized the name immediately. She was the daughter of Mrs. Gable, the kind, elderly woman who had lived next door to my grandmother for 50 years. Linda had a small bookkeeping business in town, but Ben discovered something else. Her notary license had been suspended 2 months prior to the date on the deed for procedural irregularities. "The notarization is invalid," Ben said, leaning back in his chair. "The whole transfer is built on a foundation of sand. We have the forgery, the invalid notary, and a clear motive of financial fraud. We don't need a fight, Cora. We just need a conversation." He suggested a mediation. A formal meeting in his office with me, my sister, my father, and their lawyer. It wasn't a courtroom, but in some ways, it felt even more daunting. It was a final, quiet confrontation. The day of the mediation was gray and overcast, the sky hanging low over Havenwood. I chose my clothes carefully, not a power suit, but a simple blue dress that had belonged to my grandmother. It felt like wearing a piece of her strength. As I sat at the polished conference table in Ben's office, I felt a surprising sense of calm. The outcome almost didn't matter anymore. I had already found what I was looking for, my own voice, my own sense of worth, independent of my family's approval. My father and Claire arrived with Marcus and their lawyer. They avoided my gaze, their faces tight and strained. Claire looked pale and exhausted, the perfect facade she had presented at the door of the cottage now completely gone. My father looked smaller, older. Ben laid everything out with quiet, irrefutable precision. He presented the forged deed, the evidence of Linda Gable's suspended license, the trail of Marcus's desperate loans. He spoke not in accusations, but in facts. The room was thick with a heavy, suffocating silence. Their lawyer, a slick man in an expensive suit, tried to bluster, but the evidence was overwhelming. Marcus stared at the table, his face ashen. My father's stoic mask finally crumbled, revealing the weary, frightened man beneath. But it was Claire who finally broke. A single tear traced a path through her foundation, leaving a stark, pale line. She looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time since I had returned. Her eyes were filled with a maelstrom of emotions, anger, shame, and a deep, bottomless well of hurt. "You don't understand what it was like," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You left. You got to be the hero, the one everyone admired. I stayed. I was the one here when Mom got sick, when Dad's store was failing. I was the one who had to watch Grandma fade away. And then, for her to leave you the cottage, it was like everything I did, all the years I was here, meant nothing. It was like she loved you more." Her words hit me with the force of a physical blow. In all my self-reflection, I had understood her resentment, but I had never grasped the depth of her pain, the feeling of being invisible, of being second best. The cottage wasn't about money, it was about love. My own anger, the last vestiges of it, dissolved, replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. I saw her not as my adversary, but as my little sister, lost and hurting. I looked at Ben, then back at my family. I took a deep breath. I don't want to press charges, I said, my voice clear and steady. The lawyers on both sides looked stunned. I don't want to destroy our family. What I want is for the truth to be acknowledged. I want the fraudulent deed rescinded and the title of the cottage returned to Grandma Annalise's estate to be handled legally and fairly. I turned to Claire. And I want you to know that Grandma didn't love you less. She knew you were already home. She gave me the cottage because she knew I was the one who was lost, the one who needed an anchor. It was never about value. It was about need. I paused, letting my words settle in the quiet room. The cottage itself, it's just wood and nails. The memories are what matter. But the principle, the truth, that matters too. I laid out my terms, with Ben's guidance. The transfer would be voided. Marcus and my father would have to find another way to settle their debts. The cottage would be placed in a trust, with its future to be decided by all of us, together, when the time was right. I wasn't demanding victory. I was offering a path to peace. A path built on the foundation of truth. There was no shouting, no dramatic capitulation. Just a slow, weary nod from my father and a quiet, choked, okay from Claire. The fight was over. Weeks have passed since that day. The legal paperwork is done. The cottage on Willow Creek Lane is safe, held in trust, waiting. I'm still living at the Millstream Motel, but it no longer feels like a place of exile. It feels like a way station, a place of transition. I've spent my days rediscovering Havenwood, not as a ghost from the past, but as a resident of the present. I've had coffee with Ben, walked the trails with old friends, and even volunteered a few hours a week at the town's small medical clinic. I am slowly, carefully, stitching myself back into the fabric of this place. My relationship with my family is fragile, a delicate, tentative thing. There have been no grand apologies, no tearful reunions. Healing, I know, is a quiet act. It happens in the small spaces between words. It happened a few days ago, when my father left a box of my grandmother's poetry books on the doorstep of my motel room, with no note. It happened yesterday, when Claire called and, after a long, awkward silence, asked me if I remembered how to make Grandma Annalise's famous apple crumble. I do, I told her, my heart aching with a bittersweet mix of sorrow and hope. I remember it perfectly. Maybe, she said, her voice small, you could come over on Sunday and show me. This evening, I drove to Willow Creek Lane. I didn't go to the cottage, but to the small stone bridge that crosses the creek just down the road. I sat on the edge, my feet dangling above the rushing water, and watched the last rays of the sun paint the sky in shades of rose and lavender. The cottage stood in the distance, a dark silhouette against the vibrant sky. It is no longer a battleground or a prize. It's a symbol of a painful, necessary journey that brought me back not just to a place, but to myself. I had traveled the world searching for a way to heal others, only to find that the most important journey was the one back to my own heart, back to the difficult, complicated, and unbreakable bonds of family. Home, I've learned, is not a place you inherit. It's a truth you build within yourself, a quiet space of integrity and forgiveness. The future is unwritten, the reconciliation uncertain. But as I sat there, listening to the gentle music of the creek, I felt a profound sense of peace. I had found my anchor. I was finally home.